Hey, good morning, everyone. I am recording this a little bit last minute, so sorry if you've tried to access this a little bit earlier. Here we are. It's fine. It's great. I just wanted to give you a couple of notes of sort of where we're at, some updates before we get into our topic for the week. So now is the time to begin working on your project. Hopefully by now you have seen the video that I've posted sort of outlining some of the expectations of your final project. So I would say now is the time to begin establishing your research topic and beginning to source some of that information. Please see me if you need some guidance on this. If I don't hear from you, I'm going to assume no news is good news, so let me know if you need some help. Also, on that note, if you are behind on work, if there's a couple of things that are missing that you've been sort of meaning to catch up on, now is the time to get that together and in. We've only got, well, after, not counting today, we've got 6 classes left, so not a lot of time. There's only about 2 weeks left if you don't include our final block. So there's not a ton of time to get this done, and I'm sure you've got other things going on too. So if you're having trouble catching up on some of your back work, please let me know. Let's come up with a plan. We'll make it work. As you know, your final project will include a presentation component. So the commitment that I'm asking for you is about an hour of your time total for your final. And so not all of that is going to be for your presentation. So only about 15 minutes of that will be you actually presenting. And then there will be an allotted up to 15 minutes for Q&A. And so this can be done asynchronously if needed. Please let me know right away if you are going to need to do your project asynchronously. That's totally fine. We'll make it work, but we'll need to make some arrangements for that. And then everyone else who is doing their project synchronously will sign up for time slots. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on Monday, but essentially you can plan for now on those times being both Thursday, the 28th, so during your normally scheduled class periods. So you guys are in periods 4 and 6. So it'll be Thursday the 28th. Actually, I think I have that as period 5 and 6. So period 4 will be a different day. I'll have to get back on that. I think I mixed that up a little bit. And then Tuesday the 2nd, or no, I'm sorry, the 28th is good because you guys both have Thursday classes. Tuesday is the different one. I believe period 4 is actually going to be Wednesday. So I'll update that on Monday and we'll have more information then. The other time commitment, that other half hour, I'm asking you to attend Bio 100's projects. So they're going to attend yours, and in return, you are going to attend theirs. So they're going to have the same type of deal, up to 15 minutes for their presentation, and then up to 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm asking about an hour total of you for your final component of this course. If that's going to be a problem, please let me know. We can do this all asynchronously. That's not an issue. That's all I got for the moment. So let's talk a little bit about conservation biology. So that's the topic of the week. I tried to record this last night, but it was very late and it didn't. I was a rambling mess by the middle of it. So we're going to try this again this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about conservation biology. So this is a little bit different from other topics that we've covered this year in terms of there isn't a lot of new terminology or, real data that we're looking at. So that's why we're not having a quiz on this material, but it's more sort of, naming and outlining these existing concepts that we may have already been aware of just, by virtue of existing as a human in the world. And so, we're just kind of giving this a little bit of language to talk about these ideas and topics. So we care about conserving species, because when we lose biodiversity in the world on Earth, we lose ecosystems. We lose entire ecosystems sometimes. We also lose individual species. And when we lose species, we lose the genes that they possessed. And so we'll talk about why that specifically is important shortly. So just kind of some sobering information here. 80% of Earth's forests as of 2018 are gone. 80%. That's huge. That's almost unfathomable. And that's 2 years old at this point, almost 3 years old information. So that number is probably a little bit higher by now. As of 2012, that was the most recent information I could find with a number. As of 2012, about 30% of the coral reef has died. That's a big issue. Those are both huge issues. A lot of things live in the forest, not just, cute mammals that we like, and not just, neat looking fish, right? But all of the plant life and bacteria and fungi, and in the ocean, the crustaceans, and just everything. There's a huge amount of species loss that occurs when we lose the habitat for that species. And so, if you need to put figures to it that, make this maybe feel a little bit more relevant, I think when we hear things about habitat loss, it's easy to think about it in abstraction. But if, dollars and cents is more your bag, consider this, that New York City, like that New York City, right? One of the most bustling cities in the world, certainly in the country, has some of the cleanest tap water in the US. It's famous for having tap water that you can just drink, and it's fine. It's awesome. Very, very clean, very high quality. In fact, some people actually credit the tap water with why New York has such really good bagels and pizza, right? I don't know if that's true. I haven't looked into that much, but maybe we'll talk about that at some point. But anyway, they've got super clean and awesome tap water. And the reason for that is that upstate New York is very forested. And as the water cycle occurs through New York, we have the water sources being purified as they're passing through everything in that ecosystem. So they're passing through the wetlands, they're passing through the forested areas, they're passing through the rocks and the streams and the sediments, right? And as they do, stuff gets filtered out. And so by the time it reaches the New York City treatment plants, water treatment plants, all that's really left to do is it maybe needs like a light filtering, and it, they chlorinate it a little bit to kill off any pathogens that might be in there. And they'll throw a little fluoride in there for your teeth. But overall, it's super clean. And this is really remarkable, because all of this happens for free. This just happens as a result of the natural water cycle and the landscape and ecosystems of upstate New York. To equivocate this to an actual, monetary figure, it would cost $8 billion to build a filtration plant that is capable of doing the same filtration that occurs in nature for free in this particular region of the US. And then once you build it, it costs $1 million a day. $1 million. That's insane. A day to run it and to maintain it. So this is why keeping our this is, one very direct reason why keeping our forests intact is super important for us. Also, we don't like to lose species, right? If we lose species, that's very sad. I think I don't know if this maybe wasn't the case because you guys were born in in the early 2000s. But, you know, so I was born in 1990, and when I was a kid in the early 90s, there were all of these sad commercials about, you know, species going extinct and everything. And like that was like the issue of the time, was like extinction and conservation efforts towards like specific species. And so this is, you know, really tough because, you know, some scientists speculate that with, you know, with humans existing the way we do currently, and, you know, living the lives that we do, the extinction rates of species, so this isn't all like cute mammals and stuff, this is things like, you know, plant life too, and smaller, grosser things that we don't care about as much, slugs and snails and whatnot. Some scientists speculate that the rate of extinction currently may be as much as 100 times higher than what it would be naturally without human intervention. So this is hard to prove though, right? Because one, we don't know how many species exist on Earth. We've far from discovered all of those species that exist on Earth. And also, you know, we weren't recording before we weren't here, so we don't really know what the natural rate of extinction looks like of, you know, when humans are not involved. But we can sort of speculate based off of, you know, how many species of just organisms in general have we lost completely? How many species have we just completely eradicated due to direct human causes, such as deforestation, overhunting, etc. And so, you know, extinction we've all heard of. You know, extinction is when they're all gone. You know, the last rhinoceros has died, and that species is completely gone. All populations of that species have totally disappeared, and you can't take this back. Once they're gone, once the last one is gone, they're totally gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. Not yet, at least. I mean, they figured it out in Jurassic Park, and maybe we'll get there, but we're not there right now. The term that you may not be familiar with is extirpation. And so extirpation is when we lose just a single population of a species in an area, right? So this is when, for example, we destroy a habitat such that the organism, such that like a single population of an organism is displaced, cannot survive, and dies. That would be one cause of extirpation. Lots of other things could cause this. You could have, you know, a volcanic eruption and destroy a whole, you know, ecosystem and habitat at the base of the mountain, for example, and that would be extirpation of all of the populations within that ecological community. But this isn't extinction, because we're just saying that we have, or not we, but we're just saying that the organisms within this particular area have all died. They are totally gone. There's no more of them in this area, but there are some somewhere else. So the population is gone, but the species is still intact because individuals are continuing to survive in other areas. So one of the examples of this, so you might be wondering about this very flat, plump guy over here. So this is the black-tailed prairie dog, and he is basically me this last week. This is kind of how I've been feeling. It's been a very week. And so the prairie dog is really interesting because he sort of, you know, creates biodiversity through modification of his own habitat. So prairie dogs, unless you live in the Midwest, you may not be familiar with them, or unless you're, you know, a weirdo biologist like me and you read about prairie dogs for fun. What they actually do is they burrow. So they, you know, they're kind of like a groundhog or a woodchuck, right? And so they burrow into the plains, And as they do, they're sort of digging up the dirt, they're loosening the soil, they may like move rocks out and clear out dead roots, things like that, as they're burrowing their little holes. And so what's interesting about this is that certain species of arthropods and certain plant life will actually take up in the spaces where they have sort of dug up their dirt and loosened the soil, right? Because it's a prairie, so it's like pretty packed down. It's maybe kind of dry. It's not like a desert certainly, but think like a dry meadow almost. And so, you get a lot of biodiversity just by virtue of having the dirt dug up, right? And that's pretty cool. So the prairie dogs, I mean, they don't live forever, and they don't also stay in the same spot forever. So what's interesting is that the holes that they burrow will be repurposed. So certain other species, so certain snakes, rabbits, other rodents, and certain types of burrowing owls will actually take up residence in the holes that the prairie dog has left. And so they'll specifically seek out holes that a prairie dog has left and sort of take up residence there and move in. And so by doing this, it's a chain reaction. A new species moves in, and then, now you have the sort of residual and surrounding impacts of that other species being present. Nano's got a lot to say about this particular topic, apparently. I hope that isn't too distracting. It is super loud here. I don't know how well you can hear it, but it is really, really loud here. Anyway, I hope it's not too distracting. Sorry about that. So anyway, so that's the fable of the prairie dog. He's very flat, he's very plump, and he's very cute and very useful for biodiversity. So thinking about other types of diversity, so in genetic diversity, with the loss of genetic diversity, that's what I meant to say. I realized I started my sentence incorrectly. So with the loss of genetic diversity, this poses huge issues too. So when we have extirpation of a population within an area, this is deeply problematic because when we lose individual populations, we begin to lose the potential for microevolution within that species. And so as we lose the potential for microevolution, so that transference of genetic information through alleles passed down through mating and exchange between populations through gene flow, we wind up threatening the longevity, resilience, and adaptability of the species because they begin to lose the ability to potentially adapt to different situations. So, for example, if we have crops, right? Certain types of crops like wheat are very vulnerable to pathogens. And so if we are being responsible agriculturally, and this may be information that I hope you might find useful for developing your projects also, because this is kind of directly related, but as we grow things like wheat and soy and corn, right? If we're being responsible agriculturally, we are not growing just the same species over and over and over and over again without ever crossing it with another species of wheat, without ever essentially, cross-pollinating the wheat to create genetically diverse offspring. We're not essentially just planting clones of the same wheat over and over and over again if we're being agriculturally responsible. Unfortunately, we are often not agriculturally responsible. And so we do just plant clones of the same exact wheat that we like all the time. And so as a result, you wind up with a crop that is really vulnerable to pathogens. And this is because it lacks the genes that could have been inherited to potentially protect against these genes. So you wind up with a crop that is maybe vulnerable to a pathogen and then is never able to evolve mutations that are potentially beneficial for the survival of that plant against the pathogen. And so this is a real problem because we've got this this fungus called wheat stem rust. That's what's pictured here, this like really gross thing on the screen here. And wheat stem rust decimates crops. Back in the like early 2000s, there were huge just ravages of wheat crops in parts of Africa and Central Asia, and this was horrific, you know, for these areas because this created you know, a shortage of wheat, and for underprivileged populations and populations with low income and poor access to food and poor food security, they wound, you know, for whom wheat may be a staple crop, they wound up having to go without, and so there was famine in many areas. So this has real and profound consequences that we need to be aware of and really cautious of. And so if we're being responsible, right, if we're practicing responsible and sustainable agriculture, we are, you know, cross-pollinating and, you know, perpetuating genetically diverse strains of crops. So another cause for concern is pollution, which of course I'm sure we're all familiar with. You know, you don't want to litter, right? Like, please don't throw your garbage on the ground. Don't be a jerk. But pollution also will take the form of things like emissions from our cars, homes, etc. Things like oil spills, which are pretty horrific, and then the use of pesticides. So, you know, I could have showed you here pictures of sad seagulls and turtles, you know, covered in oil. And I could have showed you pictures of, you know, the fish that have the plastic rings stuck on them, and the turtles that have swallowed balloons and gotten really sick. You've probably seen these pictures before. If you haven't, it's sobering to see. I didn't share that here because I think that's almost belaboring the point a little bit, but these things, these consequences are real, and they are horrific, and they're disturbing to see, quite frankly. But perhaps more disturbing, I think, is, you know, and what we maybe need to be more aware of are the things that don't evoke such an emotional reaction. One of the most prevalent pollutants in our system, in our general biosphere, is mercury, actually. So if you've ever heard that you shouldn't eat a lot of fish because it contains mercury, this is kind of why. So essentially what happens is through the process of producing plastic and burning coal, we produce a form of mercury that is not I mean, it's not like you don't want to like come in contact with it, you don't want to like drink it or anything, but it's not particularly toxic, but it is a byproduct of these industries, right? And so because the industries of plastic production and the coal industry are quite large and prevalent, we have quite a lot of this entering the system. And so it winds up, this mercurious compound winds up entering aquatic ecosystems through industrial runoff. So rainwater hits it, it runs into the waterways, percolates into the ground, etc. And when it does, it winds up getting converted into a molecule that is toxic to humans called methylmercury. This is extremely toxic to humans. And and it gets converted to methylmercury by bacteria that live in the benthic layer of the ocean sediment. So these are essentially bacterium that live on the ocean floor that are converting this mercury as part of their just respiratory processes into methylmercury, which is very toxic to us. And so then as they release that methyl mercury, it's in the waterways. And so it gets absorbed by all the fish and, shellfish and everything that are sort of passing through. And so this is why fish have a concentration of mercury in them and why you shouldn't eat too much of them. So the general rule is that if you're wondering like which fish has the most mercury, right? Larger fish are going to have more mercury. That's just kind of the rule of thumb. So things like, so tuna, is kind of notorious as having, a huge amount of mercury because they grow to be quite large and they live for a fairly long time in those mercury polluted waters before they're caught and, processed into food that we buy at the store or the market. Smaller fish are generally going to have a lower concentration because just simply they have lived a shorter period of time, and there has just been less time there's been less time for their bodies to metabolize and internalize the mercury that's in the waterways. In general, I mean, you're probably not going to get mercury poisoning easily if you're eating a balanced diet, but if you're eating nothing but tuna fish, 24/7, which why would you? That's kind of gross. Then you would wind up potentially experiencing some sort of, harm from that. So the other thing that I want to, sort of bring attention to, and what we've got sort of pictured right here, is the concept of microplastics. So this is an issue that has sort of risen to prevalence within, I guess sort of the popular dialogue in the last, I'd say maybe maybe not 10 years, maybe like 7 or 8 years. And so microplastics are, kind of insidious. Female, people in the group, you may remember that, if you've ever seen, it was really popular, a couple years ago, but those like hand sanitizers and face washes that had the little like microbeads in them. They had these little like tiny, if you don't know what I'm talking about, they were basically these, bath and body products. And I think I've still seen them in some hand sanitizers, but they were these like bath and body products that had these like teeny tiny little like plastic beads in them. And I don't know what the purpose of them was, but they were there. And, some like exfoliating products will sometimes have things like that in them. And so, what microplastics are is either these little beads, right? So these little teeny tiny beads that are intentionally created to be that small, or it is sort of the debris and breakdown of plastics that have become really, really teeny tiny just by virtue of essentially being tossed around the ecosystem for long periods of time until they break down into very, very fine particles. And so the problem is that they enter the food chain usually by being mistaken for small food particles, by fish and other organisms that feed that way. And they enter the food system. And so then this plastic gets processed into the fish's body. We may consume it, or another organism may consume it. And so what you wind up with is this accumulation of plastic. I'm not talking like chunks of plastic, but you wind up with an accumulation of plastic that is present within the human body and is present within the bodies of other organisms. Because this is so recently under research, we don't know what the consequences of this are. We know what happens when we consume mercury. We don't know what happens when we consume microplastics yet. Are we fine? Are we not? We don't really know. If you're interested in learning what products you might be using contain microplastics, It's shockingly more than you would think. I'm putting in a shameless plug for this website, beatthemicrobead.org. You can look up whatever bath and body products you're using, and it will tell you if it contains any compounds that are considered microplastics, and you can consider switching them to another product that does not contain microplastics so that our waterways are not polluted. So other stuff that we would see, obviously, if we start over harvesting our resources, right? We start overfishing, we will disrupt ecosystems that way by essentially eliminating whole populations of an organism within a community. If we overforest, if we're over harvesting wood, resources, cutting down a lot of trees to get lumber to build things, this is a problem too. Those trees play a very important role in their ecosystem also. They provide habitat to a lot of organisms and more. We start tearing down, or we start, building over marshes, filling in marshes and wetlands, and disrupting prairies for urban development. This is going to have resounding impacts too. And of course, things like mining, right? Like we're digging into the earth and we are causing all of this destruction to get, shiny rocks that we like through the earth. That's going to cause major habitat disruption. And this isn't even to think of things like fracking, right? Which is horrifically damaging to the earth. And if you're not familiar with what that is, essentially a large amount of water is used to blast away rock. And so there's a profound and disturbing waste of water involved. And often there are resounding impacts in terms of like disturbing the rock layers. Earthquakes can be caused by this, among other problems. Things to consider are that currently over 50% of all of the human accessible land and all of the accessible freshwater resources on Earth have been exploited by humans. And that doesn't mean that we've destroyed all of them. I don't mean that when I say exploited, but what I do mean is that, we are currently accessing that much. We are in the year 2020. If we want to live another, 20 years and beyond, hopefully, if we care about the longevity of our species and all of the species that we depend on, whether we realize it or not, we need to recognize that this is not sustainable. We cannot keep going at this pace. And so for perspective, the statistic I looked at before this, so over 50% is the current estimate. The previous one I found was in 2012, so 8 years ago, 40% was used, right? Or sorry, almost 40%. So in the high 30% just 8 years ago, and now we're to over 50%. It's not sustainable. We cannot continue at this pace. And so we need smart people who care about these issues to come up with inventive solutions so that the human species will get on board with conserving it, because we only have one planet that we know of. And this is what we got. So if we want to survive, long term, if we care about the longevity of our species, then we will fix this somehow. The other issue that I'll just quickly touch on is the issue of invasive species. So they can take all kinds of forms. So invasive species, you have almost certainly seen an example of. If you live in Andover and you've seen a ladybug before, chances are good that is not a ladybug. Chances are good that is actually an invasive beetle that originated from somewhere in Central Asia and came here through the import of pre-sprouted plants and potting soils. And so it came here and basically it just decimated everything in its path and was super successful. And now we have a ton of them, and they look just like ladybugs, but they are not true ladybugs. They're murderous jerks. I actually forget what the name of them is, otherwise I'd tell you to look them up, but they're just like these terrible beetles. And if you've ever seen, if you're familiar with knotweed, it's a like woody growth that will come back year after year, probably more than it was before in the previous year. You'll see it in your yard and on the side of your driveway. It almost looks like bamboo, but it's sort of red and has these like shiny leaves on it. But it's got a very like woody stalk. You can actually eat the young stalks. Apparently they're pretty good. But it's terribly hard to get rid of because it forms these very, very thick root systems underneath the soil that if you try to pull it up, it will just destroy the soil. And if you leave any part of the root, it will just regrow the next year. So invasive species can be really, really disruptive to existing communities because they're competing for those same resources that the existing community is. And if the invasive species happens to be stronger, then they could outcompete some of the existing things that are there, disrupting the organisms that are native to that space. So that's all I've got for today. I know that's kind of a lot, and it's definitely, not super pleasant stuff to think about. But let me know if you have any questions or if you want to go over any of this stuff. But more importantly, work on your project. Please work on your project and catch up on whatever you might be missing. And let me know if you need any help with that. And if I don't hear from you, I will assume that you're okay, but I hope to hear from you. And I'll talk to you soon.